Mr. Shorter, I appreciate it. Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of the board. Thank you for the opportunity to brief you on the state of our drinking water. I know there's been a lot of questions, especially PFAS coming in the national news, so I feel it's about the time to brief you on the latest. Like Mr. Shorter said, I'll give you a kind of a high-level briefing of the issues and also mitigation strategies. Dr. Grant will follow me in regards to more detail and the data. Also have Mr. Don Panel with me. He's our Deputy General Manager over operations. Hopefully you won't stump me with really hard questions. If you do, I have Don here to help me. Appreciate it. So Prince William Water, also formerly known as the Service Authority, in case you didn't know. Water and wastewater providers for folks here in the county, about 380,000 people. We do our part to help protect public health and the environment. We take that very seriously. As we go through this presentation and in the future, I'll talk a lot about source water or water sources for the county. And source water and source water protection, just think of it this way. Source water is the body of water we use to treat for drinking water. So for us in Prince William County, we have Fairfax Water that provides our wholesale water. They take water from the Occoquan for the eastern portion of the county and Potomac River for the western portion of the county. Also, City of Manassas, we get water from them from Lake Manassas. And also we have a well system in Bull Run. I want to say that at Prince William Water, we do not operate a water treatment plant. We do have a wastewater treatment plant, but not a water treatment plant. So I have to stress the importance of the protection of these bodies of water and also the watershed, because if you think of it this way, the more polluted that water is, the more intense and more advanced treatment you'll need for drinking water purposes. So I'm here really to talk about some challenges as an industry, PFAS, salinity, and water supply. PFAS is a growing concern on the national scale. Now we have federal mandates to remove PFAS out of our drinking water. Salinity has become a growing concern also. Not a mandated concern or any limit set, but we're seeing salinity increase. And then also water supply. I know I'll get questions about water supply as it relates to growth in the county, if we have enough water supply, and I'll answer that question as I go. So PFAS, what is that? I'll say PFAS to cover thousands and thousands of these different types of synthetic chemicals that do not break down. So you'll hear comments like PFOS, PFOA. There's a variety of them, but they are used in different products, and they don't break down. And what happens is it gets into our systems in a variety of ways. So naturally, they're saying it gets in through the drinking water, which is true, but there's other ways it does that too. So very serious stuff here, various health impacts in regards to the type of cancers, impacts to your immune system, a number of things. So how does it get into drinking water? But first I have to say, you know, the entire cycle, and I'll go through it, but I've learned that 99% of humans have a level of PFAS in them already. So PFAS is dating back to the 50s, and they're in all kinds of products we use. For example, stain-resistant carpets, anything that repels water. And you'll hear me say parts per trillion as a concentration. That is a measure that you'll hear quite a bit. Parts per trillion is PPT. And what does that mean? Just think of one drop of water in 20 Olympic-sized pools, really small trace. So I'll say PPT because that is actually associated with the mandates we have to meet. Just to give you an idea how we're exposed besides drinking water, I talked about carpets. They could be up to 470,000 PPT. Lipsticks, mascaras, 200,000 to 1.6 million parts per trillion. Food packaging. Now, I'm guilty of getting cheeseburgers, fast food, and those wrappers. I didn't know, but I have a lot of PFAS in those wrappers. upwards to 7 million to 900 million PPT, food packaging, and also a concern, Supervisor Angry could appreciate this, major source of PFAS is AFFF, firefighting foams, has a good amount of PFAS in it. I just gave you some real surprising news, but good direction as a country. A lot of the industries are moving towards not using these type of chemicals. Just FYI. So if you have lipstick, don't necessarily stop using it. Just check it out. All right. Okay. All right. So PFAS cycle. This is just a visual of how it gets into our systems. It's all over the place. You can see the top left corner is PFAS producing industry. They're making the chemicals. And there's three aspects, in my opinion, three sources. First is sources and users. Sources who makes the PFAS, and then who's sending these chemicals to a variety of users. So you have these folks that make the chemicals, they treat their wastewater, discharge it to the bottom, which would be an example of source water, a river or groundwater. And that is a source, again, for drinking water to be treated. PFAS gets in that way, and they're not treating for PFAS. Also, AFFF has been sent to a variety of airports, military installations. It's very effective in putting those fuel fires out. Very effective, but also harmful. Also, the users they're making household goods, like I said, food packaging. And all that is at some point getting into our groundwater and surface runoff into our source water. Second aspect is a pass-through. Pass-through meaning water and wastewater utilities. So the middle right there, the wastewater treatment plant, you could have a PFAS producing industry that's not treating PFAS, sending that wastewater to the local wastewater plant. This wastewater plant is not treating for PFAS yet either. So it's passing through, discharging right into the source water. Also, you have agriculture, you have landfills, that you have leachate from landfills could run off or get into groundwater. At some point, it will get into the source water. So the third aspect is human exposure. Again, drinking water. Water treatment plants aren't necessarily treating for PFAS at the moment. There are some, because they know that they've had a problem for a long time, but we have finally got the regulations. So when we drink that water, it has a level of PFAS in it. Also, the biosolids from our wastewater plants could be land-applied fertilizer. There is debate about that actually getting PFAS into our foods, on top of the food packaging, and we're eating that and we're getting that into the system. And then also, as humans, we have human waste that goes to the wastewater plant with the PFAS we have in it, and it's not treated, and it's one real nasty cycle. So I'm saying all this because I don't want you to walk out thinking that PFAS is only in drinking water. It's literally everywhere, and really the goal is to really get it out of our environment. Now, what does that mean? How are we getting PFAS in our systems? The exposure is about 20% drinking water. The rest is 80%. Again, health risk, liver damage, a number of other things. This is really why the EPA is being real strict in regards to drinking water regulations. So we finally got the mandates in April of this year. Parts per trillion, going back to that PPT, the one drop in 20 Olympic-sized pools. So the first two PFAS compounds, PFOA, PFOS, those are the older legacy PFAS chemicals. You think about the cookware, the Teflons, all those type of companies from the 50s. Those are the original ones. The goal is 0, but the mandate is what's called a maximum contaminant level, MCL, is 4 PPT. And then these other ones are sort of newer, still older, but sort of newer in hopes to replace those original 2. Those are also harmful too. So those are set at 10 parts per trillion. So the mandate is April 2024, we had 5 years to comply. By 2029, we have to be under those MCLs, and that is the goal. You'll see that we're required to start monitoring sampling by 2027, and we've already started doing that in 2021 just to get an idea of where this PFAS is coming from in our community. So what does that look like for us in Prince William? For the most part, we're compliant, our drinking water, except for drinking water drawn from the Occoquan. The last 3 quarters of sampling of drinking water from the Occoquan, you can see if the mandate was today, we would not be in compliance. So we're seeing concentrations of 5 ppt to 8 ppt. And that will require technically more advanced treatment from Fairfax water. So here's our cycle here in our watershed, the Occoquan watershed. There are known sites and there's some potential sites that are contributing PFAS to our environment. Typical are airports, the AFFF for those fires they have to put out. Legacy military sites, even hazardous sites. Airports are a good source for PFAS. We have Dulles, we have Manassas Airport. We have the Upper Occoquan Service Authority. They are a wastewater treatment facility that services the western portion of our county. There is a level of PFAS coming from their discharge. They're not treating PFAS yet either. We are also sampling the waterways. There's hits of PFAS in all those waterways, Bull Run, Cub Run. And that's how it's getting in. We have industry that, legacy industry that PFAS is getting in groundwater, surface water, runoff, stormwater runoff. And that's how we're getting these higher than the limits in regards to PFAS in the Occoquan. So the path forward to compliance, and that's the plan to be compliant by 2029, of course. Fairfax Water, from a treatment standpoint, they're looking at 3 technologies. Right now, they are leaning towards carbon absorption. And what is that? That's meaning, the way I compare that is to your normal filter you have in your house or in your refrigerator for drinking water that has a level of carbon in it. And particles, when they go through that filter, it sticks to the carbon. So carbon absorption is a much larger scale at a treatment plant, but same concept. It looks favorable. They're doing pilot studies right now. They're looking at, as is, this is a cost, $389 million for design and construction over the next 6 years. We have 5 years to be compliant, and that's not a lot of time. So those dollars are very significant. Even more significant is the ongoing O&M costs annually. That would be a 20% increase to their O&M budget to maintain this technology. So there's ways to get it out of our drinking water. Very confident in that. But also it's going to take more than just treatment, in my opinion. It's going to take controlling the source of PFAS, removing PFAS in our environment. We're going to say one water quite a bit. When I brief you in the future, it'll be one water again. I know Dr. Gran will say one water is framework for collaboration and partnering with other organizations, especially in our community, because we provide water and wastewater. But I talked about stormwater runoff, water quality, regulations. It's going to take a joint effort. One Water brings us all together to collaborate and integrate strategies to improve the situation. We cannot do this in silos because it will just continue to have the same issue we have now. So our One Water approach, we've started already, and thank you to Mr. Shorter, Wade Hugh. They've been at the table every time we ask about how we can better manage stormwater or get messaging out about PFAS and protection of the watershed. I have to say, as a industry, water industry, I think it's unanimous across the board that we subscribe to the polluter pays principle. So if you're putting this in the environment, then you pay to remove it. That could be a variety of things: stop using it, or paying for cleanup. You may hear on the national news about these class action lawsuits, and that's another way polluter pays. Because that $389 million I just quoted would have to be put on ratepayers. We want to get that burden off of ratepayers because it's not really their fault in regards to why we have to do more advanced treatment. Fairfax Water right now is working on draft legislation in the next session of the General Assembly to get more teeth in regarding requiring pretreatment programs from industry that is using PFAS and discharging it, and that's favorable. I've met with a couple supervisors over time, the ones most impacted, Supervisor Bodie and Supervisor Franklin, and I always get this question about what you can do to help. I didn't have the answer. I have the answer now. All right. So I have to say that I'm really happy to see your General Assembly agenda with PFAS and salinity already listed, so we're on the same page. Looking for continued legislation. Right now, we were successful last year with Delegate Roussel and Senator McPike regarding passing a bill to require DEQ to get more involved with source assessment, who's putting PFAS in the system, in the environment, getting a little more teeth. But in my opinion, that's just not enough. Because right now, we can just identify sources of PFAS, and they could just say, oh, that's good, we'll just keep doing it, right? We have no teeth for you to stop. So the legislation that I would really support, depending on how it's written, of course, but banning all non-essential use of PFAS. For that. Also, requiring industry to have these pretreatment programs with PFAS in their permits to give us more teeth, and then also any legislation that supports polluter pays. Because I can't emphasize enough, we have to stop PFAS at its source. Because as soon as it's produced, it's in our environment, it's in our air, it's in our water, it's in our food. The other challenge we have is a growing concern is salinity. Salinity, you'll hear salinity, you'll hear sodium, you'll hear salts. Currently, that's not being treated either in our water or wastewater plants. Reason being is it was never a concern until now. Where's it coming from? What is going on? Why is it happening? These are, I don't expect you to read all these dots, but just gives you an idea. These are uptrends of salinity in a variety of waterways across the country. So it's not necessarily unique to us here in Prince William. How's it getting in? Obviously, road salts and snows. VDOT puts down the salts to make sure we melt the ice and can have a safe driving experience. But what happens there is snow melts, storm water, it rains, it washes it into the storm drain. At some point, it gets to the Occoquan, increasing salinity in that waterway. Also, I think we're guilty of it too, with our tough HOAs. Get salt off, salt your sidewalks, your driveways. That is also running off into storm drains and at some point getting to the Occoquan. Even our household use of detergents has a level. It goes to the wastewater plant. Again, it's not treating it. So that content, that sodium is going into the waterway at some point. Even the foods we digest, of course. So the data is showing there is, this last bullet's not there, but I'll explain it. There's no regulatory limit, but EPA recommends certain things. You want to keep the concentration under or less than 20 milligrams per liter for folks that are on the low sodium diets, and then also threshold for taste in our drinking water of 200 milligrams per liter. That's when it's supposed you could taste salt in the water, in the drinking water. We haven't gotten there yet, and hopefully not. But our source water, again, Potomac seems to be pretty steady under the 20 milligrams per liter, but also The Occoquan, you see it's an uptrend. Some years over 20. But there is an uptrend, and it's definitely a concern. It's getting there to be concerning. I've talked to Fairfax Water and UOSA, and also on our side, we have our wastewater plant too, is what we can do in regards to reducing salinity. Now, it can be solved in the drinking water with more and more advanced treatment, reverse osmosis, and it's able to do it that way too. But the problem with reverse osmosis is it's really, really expensive. So I brought this to Mr. Shorter's attention a while back, and we decided to form a task force, Occoquan Reservoir Task Force. It includes us, the county staff, and also Fairfax Water, really trying to hone in on salt management, the use of salt. Like I said, us as citizens use it smarter. You can scoop it back up. You don't have to put the whole bag or bucket on the driveway. Scoop it up because it will run off. Also, we talk about source water protection as a task force, what we can do in regards to stormwater management, how we can help there. Then also, I am in the process of reaching out to VDOT to get an idea if they're doing anything differently to manage salt, and also public messaging. So I said all this about us with the salt usage. We have to get the word out, so we've partnered on messaging. And we do have a website or link towards salt management on our side. The question from you all, continued support and potential legislation, because we may have industries that actually are discharging high levels of sodium into the Occoquan. So I favor any local limits or mandates or anything like that to support. So water supply. Sometimes I get wind of folks saying we don't have enough water in the county for growth, and that's not true. We take the demands from the comp plan, from MWCOG, population growth, typical water use, and we project out. We have dynamic hydraulic models. We look at really to see if we can handle the additional growth. And if we don't, we identify capital needs. At that point, we put that in our master plan for capital needs that is needed to supply additional growth. And of course, we're always looking at how that impacts our water supply. So this graph pretty much sums it up. But the gray top dash line is our total maximum day demand. Basically says that this is the max we can go. And we're looking at the max demand on a daily basis, not the average, but the max, to see if we can handle it. That yellow dash line is our 80% utilization of our total supply. As a trigger line, it tells us if our usage grows and gets to that point, we need to start planning for additional water supply. As you can see, the yellow line is starting to trend up, and you'll see this one big spike. It gets to close to that yellow dash line, and that's actually COVID pandemic, where people were home most of the time and you use more water when you're home, right? So that's kind of an outlier, but it's still going up. So we're trending up because we're getting more industry and commercial growth in the county and some residential. So we're starting to see the water usage go up. That green line is us projecting further out. So we're getting close to that trigger line in 2025. And who we're going to talk to about that, Fairfax Water, is like, well, we need to start planning for additional water supply because we're going to hit it around 2040. We're going to exceed what we have already. So we've already reached out to them, and we're working on additional water supply, which they have. So that gray dash line will increase. We'll have enough water supply. And they will draw from the Potomac for that additional water supply. So water supply is not necessarily a concern, but we're very careful with planning. I don't want you to walk out and thinking that we have plenty of water and it's all good. We do, but we're going to be careful with it, with the planning process. Also, with new growth, I say this every time I give a presentation, growth pays for growth. If you want to develop here in the county, you have to pay for that infrastructure. whatever that is, and the additional storage. So it's a lot to digest, and I think it's my last slide. So I'd open up to any questions you may have.
I'm actually going to take the first one because you were saying that, what we can do, but to cut back on PFAS. But what is the answer? Because I don't feel like you gave an answer. And you mentioned community messaging around PFAS. Can you give us some examples of messaging that you guys are using?
Yeah, so the messaging, we have our FAQs on our website, just educating you just like I did, the household usage, how it's getting into drinking water. Right now, there's no teeth for a manufacturer to stop using it and putting it into the environment. There's nothing. So right now, we could say when we look around for sources, hey, you have a lot of PFAS coming from there, and they could literally say, well, yeah, that's great, and keep it moving. Legislation, like, there's one similar one in Maryland. Maryland, I think, passed no essential use of PFAS, stop all usage. That could help. But only that legislation is only for this day forward. There's still legacy issues with PFAS. Depending on, and to say non-essential use, the AFFF, definitely harmful, but very effective, for fighting fires. I would consider that as essential use, with a lot of safety measures for the firefighters, of course. So I can't say, hey, get it down to 2 PPT. Would just like you just get it out of the environment completely if you can. Also, there's no mechanism for these industries to pay unless you do a class action lawsuit, which tends to be a somewhat successful, but it's not necessarily going to recover all your costs you've had over time or even in the future costs to address that treatment. So it's going to take more than what we were seeing before in regards to that. And I know it's not easy to stop PFAS at the industry level, but that's kind of my general thought.
Supervisor Franklin. Supervisor Bodie.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Farr, for the presentation. I appreciate that this has sort of been a building conversation I know we've had for years, so appreciate you coming back to talk about this. To sort of sharpen a little bit Madam Chair's question, could you go back to the slide? Actually, yeah, keep going. You missed one too far, I think. So that one, yeah. So we have the task force, we have partnerships, we have sort of a framework to begin addressing it. Are there any local things that we can do to begin looking at this, right? Are there things that we can look at in terms of our DCSM as an example? I know one of your later slides, I think it's slide 15, talks about supporting initial PFAS sampling of wastewater and stormwater from new developments likely to use PFAS. Are there things that we can begin to start having conversations with the county exec and the planning staff and environmental services and the other agencies that look at our land use applications to begin having that be part of the conversation as they go through the land use process?
Yes, so partial answer is yes. And I failed to say that it's already ongoing.
Okay.
So I just talked about what we should do, but Fairfax Water and us, we're already doing it, just in the early stages. So we're already approaching some of these sources already to say, have this conversation about PFAS. And honestly, in the community we're in, we haven't heard of much pushback from anybody providing or putting PFAS in the environment. But we still haven't hashed out everything from a legislative standpoint that I'd say, Supervisor Bodie, I really need your support on this.
Sure.
But there's one, that Water Systems PFAS Liability Protection Act. I didn't want to go in a lot of detail on that, but that is related to an environmental law of CERCLA, basically saying you're liable if you touch PFAS. And then we're talking about treatment processes to remove PFAS, not destroy it. So if you remove it, then you got to transport it somewhere. Mm-hmm. As soon as you transport it, it's yours, and you're liable for it. The water industry, we're all against that because we are, again, receivers of the PFAS, so that's been a big fight. New development, especially taking a look at the new industrial partners that come in the county. We want to hone in on what they're discharging, and that may require some limit or zero limit of discharge to our wastewater system. So we're not quite there yet, but things are in motion.
Sure, appreciate that. And just so I could, Madam Chair, as a follow-up, I appreciate that because as you sort of highlight, and I appreciate how you sort of frame this, it's not just one level that needs to look at this. Feds had a part to play, like you mentioned, EPA, and that piece of legislation you talked to, I believe, is in Congress or so.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
the water system PFAS liability isn't a congressional one. Like you said, the state plays a role as well. I know there's different delegates that have different pieces of legislation. They go through that every year. I know they're trying to get more involved. But then us, like I said, I think that ultimately, you know, at some point, there's going to need to be sort of a meeting of the minds where we start lining up all these pieces of legislation federally and statewide, and then to us, again, to my question, you know, have a list of recommendations come forth from our staff on things we can do to proactively, like I said, embed in our land use processes. So frankly, the development community knows that we care about it and they need to start testing for it at the outset. And two, that's an expectation of if you want to get, you know, our subject matter experts on counties have to sign off on these things, they have to care about PFAS and salinity and these things that these developments could, just by either the construction process or frankly, once it's up and running development, especially commercial, but also residential, is doing to the environment over time. And so that needs to be part of our considerations.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Supervisor Weir?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to bounce around a little bit here. With respect to both the salinity and the PFAS, you cite one of the main sources as industrial discharge. In fact, it's listed first on most of the stuff. So I'm curious, what do we do about that industrial discharge? And the reason I note that is I just read the article, I believe it was this morning, about Micron increasing its chip production as part of a deal with Department of Commerce. Do we have anything in place, even though it's, you know, typically essentially a Manassas issue, and we don't get to do much about it except accept the water? Is there anything we can do to address additional PFAS or additional salinity discharge from their ramping up? I'm assuming changing their production model?
Yes, absolutely. So say you start with sodium. They put a great deal of sodium in the waterway, but they've reduced, we approached them years back, and I think they reduced it by 100 milligrams per liter, 200 milligrams per liter. So we can go back to them and try to negotiate even more reduction of that sodium. We're fortunate in this region to, when we work with Micron, they actually want to work with us. It's not one of those, we're not going to help you out. They are partners in the community. So PFAS, especially PFOA from Micron, high levels of PFAS. So I'm not going to say it's going to be easy for people to stop using PFAS because there is a process of whatever they're doing that requires it. And to just shut it off immediately may not be practical from their operations. So I'm hearing that they are for reduction of the PFAS or PFOA, but they're looking for alternatives. So, and they are working with us as partners.
Second part of that is you say you've got to be MCL compliant by 2029. What if you're not?
Good question. Typically what happens is there'll be a consent order associated with additional timelines, could be stipulated penalties and things of that nature. Dealing with regulators in Virginia, my career, it's not a promise, but my experience is good faith is you're putting in effort. Maybe a timeline you may miss by 6 months. They're not going to really get you too bad about it. But if you're in total denial and you're not pushing forward, then that's when you really get in trouble. Also, keep in mind too, I didn't throw this part in there with the new administration. Some of these things are subject to change. Timelines, even these limits, which is really unknown. But EPA's new administrator, he's shown history to focus on the removal of PFAS where he was a senator. So.
Let's jump to the water supply. I mean, you're asserting that at present you don't have a problem or a concern based on typical growth curves from MCOG. I'm suggesting, or I'm asserting that their growth determinations or their growth projections do not include the explosive growth in data center proliferation in this area and the seemingly ever-changing model of cooling from water-based to non-water-based, and it seems like they're going back to water-based cooling systems in many instances, and I'm seeing in those plans, in the blueprints that they deliver, in their calculations for water usage is measured in the millions of gallons, tens of millions of gallons. Are you guys made aware of those at the time that they are applied, applications made to the county, or do you just find out after the fact?
Yeah, kind of sort of after the fact. I wouldn't disagree with you on, we got to wait and see. It's a bit uncomfortable that way, but I'm hearing that there's the new requirement to be more forthcoming with water usage. That helps us out quite a bit.
Okay. Which leads to the last question. If indeed infrastructure and additional operational costs are paid for by the new user, and I would suggest that there is a lot of new infrastructure being built for a particular industry. If it is indeed the case that they're supposed to pay for it, then how do you explain the 29% rate increase that you just advertised?
Well, that's that's for existing infrastructure. So those are 999 increases, nothing to do with growth. Has all to do with replacement of existing and rehabilitation of existing infrastructure. What happened was we executed over 80% execution rate, really good, of things we had to get done. As you know, we had inflation. We actually had materials go up 50% cost. So basically took away our replacement fund. So those increases are to fund the replacement fund, not for new growth or data centers or new water supply.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Supervisor Bailey.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, sir, for being here this afternoon. Really appreciate your presentation. And I like your statement when you said growth pays for growth. And with our county growing as it is, and you also said that we are kind of ahead of the power curve in this, and we need to make adjustments now. So my question is, I have two. One is our water supply currently comes from Fairfax and the Occoquan Reservoir,
Yes.
Potomac River. So is there any opportunity for One Water to be with the Potomac water supply? Is that anywhere in the cards as we go forward?
Absolutely. The reason why I didn't mention it is it's not a challenge right now in regards to these two items we're talking about, PFAS and salinity. But any partner, we already have formal partnerships with the Potomac from water supply, and it's a multi-state, as you know, with COG and these other folks for supply. So yeah, it's technically a One Water approach there too. That just didn't spotlight it, but we're not seeing those issues with the Potomac and source water.
Okay. And I appreciate you allowing me to be selfish for a minute. But the other question that I have for you is the salinity presentation that you gave is so key for us as well as PFAS. Now, is salinity, and I get them a little confused, is PFAS or is it salinity that is affecting our senior population more? Or are you?
Good question.
Yeah.
Well, it depends on if your doctor says you got to cut back on salt.
Yeah. Is that how that's the
yeah.
relationship? Okay.
And then if the water gets too salty, of course, that'll impact you. It will not help you in regards to that sodium diet you need to be on.
Yeah.
But I have to say that, I'm not a residential filter salesperson,
Yes.
but there are ways to those filters, they're RO filters, they can get salt out also in your plumbing and your fixtures. So, but we're not there yet in regards to it being unhealthy
Okay.
We're just seeing it trend up. And at some point, we have to, the priority right now, honestly, is PFAS. The salinity is there. And there's techniques for PFAS that actually apply to salt reduction also. So it is a priority, just a close second to PFAS.
Okay.
But we're not going to wait till it gets to 200 where it tastes salty.
And I appreciate that. I just asked because we have our population is aging, but very active aging. And so, okay, sorry. Not me and Bob. No. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, ma'am.
Seasoned.
Supervisor Gordy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you very much for the presentation, and thanks again for coming by a couple of weeks ago and sharing with me, the things that are going on and explaining particularly, and I appreciate the answer to Supervisor Weir's question related to costing, rate increases, and I think that gets to the fact that we've got to be more diligent at maintenance over time, so that we don't end up having these bow wave of costs that we then have to address. And I think that's something you inherited and now are trying to address. I really appreciate you establishing a new benchmark for the organization to try to address this going forward so we don't have these bow wave of costs happen again. So thank you for that. In terms of the, you talk about the Occoquan Reservoir Task Force. But even as Supervisor Weir pointed out, we've got a major industry who is not part of Prince William County. It's in a different locality. And so the task force looks like it's really focused on the end users of water, but not necessarily the source point from where the water's coming. So how do we, and we've got some of the creeks that run up into Fauquier, some that run up into Loud, and some into other parts of Fairfax, and of course Manassas Park. So how are we trying to engage broadly within the complete and the entire watershed to start looking at not just the treatment side of this, but how do we better align as a region on trying to reduce the problems from the source?
Yeah. So that one water approach, at some point, bringing in Micron as one of the partners of the one water approach, and other industries that are major contributors to these issues. So that's not final, what you just saw. That's the initial, I'd say, skeleton of it. But you're right, to have these conversations with whoever is putting these things in our environment. UOSA is one facility that's discharging. They have to come to the table too and see what they can do on their side. So it's, I wouldn't say it's, the goal is not to have all of it on treatment. Yeah. That's for sure, because I just quoted some numbers to you. Yeah. And I'm sorry, I forgot to tell you our part. So it's 389 total. We are their largest wholesale customer. We're on the hook for $72 million, which should, we did the numbers. We're looking at maybe $5 to $10 additional to a bill. So we're mindful of the affordability and rate increases and things of that nature. But getting back to the one water approach, it's one of those we have to meet, and here we're doing well, here where are the gaps? And I was like, you know what, we need to bring these folks into this conversation. So it's an evolving thing. And I wish I had the answer and had all the agencies up there laid out for you, and this is who's going to do what kind of thing. But we're not quite there yet. Well, you should have saw me last year. There was nothing. It's like, what do we do? I was running around back and forth in the hall. Like, okay, so I kind of have a framework now, but we'll continue to evolve over time on that.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about the Chesapeake Bay and what the efforts have been taken to try to solve it, we realize it's a watershed problem, not, trying to solve it in the bay is, you're never going to solve it there. You're going to have to solve it upstream. And so trying to look at it from, working with other localities as they're doing their land use, as they're trying to attract business and industry, just recognizing the fact that, being downstream from those localities, how do we have that level of influence? And so I think that's part of a broader conversation that we're going to have to have.
Absolutely. We actually have a policy in place, Occoquan policy. It's been around for decades. It still applies. And like I said, it's not just Prince William County, Fairfax, it's others. Fairfax Water is having conversations with all these other folks, other jurisdictions that I haven't mentioned, but they're tasked with watershed protection, the Occoquan watershed protection. So you're absolutely right. All these folks are involved.
Yeah. And in terms of water quantity, we talk about recognizing that, if something does happen, what's our alternative source? What if, other than just simply treatment? And so what do you see are some potential new sources of water within the area in case there is an issue where we need to either expand capacity or move away from a certain source because of pollutants that we can't manage?
Yeah, so one thing I do like with some of these, the newer industry folks, they are actually reusing some of this water, and they're being a bit more efficient, but they have to actually tap into our water at some point. So we have explored water reuse, purple pipe, they could use that as their source. We find right now, we can continue to explore it, we find right now that we are a water-rich region compared to these folks that are out West Coast that are getting 3 inches of rain in a year, and you have to actually reuse it. You have no choice. So we are all for the newer ways to provide water, even the on-site reuse of wastewater. We definitely promote that. We haven't seen any proposals from any, we'll say, data center or industry that wants to do that. The request usually is potable water. But like I said, we have ample water. We have to be careful, and based on your demand and what you're asking for, we have to really question is like, can you consider some water reuse? Because we don't want to give you 50 million gallons a day for one facility. That would be wouldn't be practical. So, to answer your question, we're for any other sources of water that they can use, and then again, they would have to, and these may require facilities on their part that they have to construct and propose to us. So.
Thank you.
Supervisor Vega.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Real quick, during the past 2 state health board meetings that we've had, we've been briefed on some localities having water crises and not having an emergency management plan in place, and some folks in these areas have been left without water for up to a week. Do we have such a plan in place, and if so, how can we familiarize ourselves with it, so that we can be ready if something similar were to happen here in Prince William?
So yes, the question is yes, and we can get that to you. We have a plan. We have interconnects with other jurisdictions. We can turn valves to get additional water. We're part of COG in regards to the Warren system, needing assistance like that. So the question is yes, we have backup plans for that. We have real-time looks at our water system. We have storage in our water system already. In case something like that happens, if you think about a water main break and water is out for a while, we rely on storage for that customer, and then we produce more water and get more water from Fairfax. So, yes, I'm very confident, actually knock on wood, but very confident in potential, response like that. We're more than prepared for that. Yep.
All right, doesn't look like we have any other speakers, so thank you so very much. And we are ready for the part 2.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. I thought Calvin set me up very nicely. My name is Stanley Gran. I'm a professor of civil and environmental engineering at Virginia Tech and director of the Occoquan Watershed Monitoring Lab, which is located more or less down the street here. Thank you. I'll just say next. Great. So here's an outline for my talk. I promised that I would prepare a script so I wouldn't be here for 3 hours talking, so a little bit more to the point. So for those not familiar with the lab, I want to begin by describing the laboratory I direct here in Manassas, the Virginia Tech's Occoquan Watershed Monitoring Lab. And then I want to provide a high-level overview of the Occoquan Reservoir and why we consider it a quote-unquote one-water system. Next, I will describe what I believe to be the defining challenge for water quality in the reservoir, that is rapid growth of population and impervious surfaces in the watershed, and its impact on water quality trends in streams draining to the reservoir. And then I will end with a quick overview of several community-centered research initiatives the lab is leading, all aimed at ensuring the reservoir's long-term viability as a drinking water resource. Next slide. So let's begin with a quick overview of Virginia Tech's OWML, or Occoquan Watershed Monitoring Lab. The Occoquan Watershed Monitoring Laboratory, or OWML, is an innovative partnership between Virginia Tech's Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering, the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality, Fairfax Water, and other water supply, public water supply, water reclamation agencies, city and county governments, and private consulting firms in Northern Virginia. Our mission is to develop and test cutting-edge transdisciplinary solutions to emerging water quality challenges using the Occoquan Reservoir in Northern Virginia as our experimental test bed. Probably the most pertinent fact to the discussion today is that the lab has been collecting water quality data in the reservoir and its tributaries for nearly 50 years. This historical data provides a wealth of information upon which to build informed policy decisions about the watershed's future, really pertaining to many of the questions that I heard you ask after Calvin's talk. Next slide. So let's talk about why the reservoir in its watershed is called a one-water system. Next slide. The Occoquan Reservoir is a drinking water supply, as you know, for up to 1 million people in Northern Virginia. It provides raw water for Fairfax Water's Griffith Drinking Water Treatment Plant, which is the blue dot in the lower right corner of the map there. This reservoir is one of the first and oldest one-water systems in the United States, by which I mean the reservoir receives inflow from stream flow and urban runoff from its two major tributaries, that is, the Occoquan River and Bull Run, shown there in the middle of the map, and treated sewage from the Upper Occoquan Service Authority, or UOSA for short, which is indicated by the blue dot in the middle of the map. Next slide. Stream flow and urban runoff enter the reservoir from the two main tributaries, the Bull Run and Occoquan River. The two sub-watersheds for these streams are shown here in dark and light brown, respectively. Next slide. The water from these two tributaries, which are shown as the large yellow arrows, and smaller tributaries located around the reservoir, the smaller yellow arrows, constitute the bulk of water entering the reservoir on an annual basis. Next slide. Layered on top of this stream hydrology is a large drinking water system for nearly 2 million people. The drinking water comes from two major water treatment plants, which are the blue dots on this map. Next slide. The Corvallis Drinking Water Treatment Plant sources its raw water from the Potomac River and provides drinking water for homes and businesses in the northern and central portion of the watershed, as indicated by the green area there in the map. The Griffith Drinking Water Treatment Plant sources its raw water from the Occoquan Reservoir and provides drinking water for homes and businesses to the south and east portions of the map, or that orange area. Next slide. The drinking water from Corvallis flows through homes and businesses and ultimately down the drain into the sewage collection network that drains to the Upper Occoquan Service Authority, UOSA, which is shown by the red boundary there. Next slide. The sewage then flows through an underground pipe network, the sewage collection system, to the UOSA treatment plant in Centerville, which is the yellow dot, big yellow dot there. Next slide. That sewage undergoes extensive treatment, and the resulting reclaimed water is discharged to Bull Run, where it mixes with stream flow and urban runoff and ultimately flows to the reservoir. Next slide. Here is a summary of the inflows to the reservoir from various sources, including Bull Run, Occoquan River, UOSA, precipitation, and other sources including unmonitored streams around the reservoir like Hoos Run and groundwater. Note that on an annual basis, the Occoquan River at 48% and Bull Run at 25% are the largest contributors of water to the reservoir, followed by other sources like groundwater at 20% and reclaimed water from UOSA at 6%. Precipitation on the reservoir surface constitutes a small fraction of the annual inflow, around 1%. So most of the flow that is coming that is coming into the reservoir comes from the surrounding watersheds and to a lesser extent from UOS's reclaimed water. Next slide. Here is a summary of the outflows from the reservoir. Fairfax Water's Griffith Water Treatment Plant accounts currently for about 12% annually of the outflow, but by far most of the outflow is through the dam spillway and ultimately back to the Potomac River. Evaporation off the reservoir is relatively minor at around 1%. Next slide. Now I want to talk about what I see as the defining challenge to reservoir water quality, population growth and imperviousness growth in the watershed. Next slide. The Occoquan watershed is home to 574,000 people, which as of 2020 is a six-fold increase since the 1970s, and that number is projected to potentially reach 750,000 people by 2040. By comparison, just to kind of benchmark that, the initial recommendations when the Occoquan policy was formed back in the 70s to safeguard the reservoir's water quality called for restricting population in the watershed to 100,000 people. So we're close to almost, or we're approaching 10 times that number. Another challenge for managing water quality in the reservoir is that, as was indicated here a moment ago, the watershed encompasses 6 different political jurisdictions, including Prince William County, which accounts for 40% of the watershed area, Fauquier County for 36% of the area, Fairfax County 17% of the area, Loudoun County 5% of the area, City of Manassas 2% of the area, and the City of Manassas Park 0.4% of the area. So there's no one political jurisdiction who can basically wave a wand and cause everything to happen in the watershed all at once. To give you a sense, next slide, to give you a sense of how population has grown in the watershed, in the next couple of slides I will present how the population density in the watershed has changed over time, where each of the colored polygons in this map represent what's called a transportation analysis zone, or TAZ. So in 2005, this is what the population density across the watershed looked like for those different TAZs, where light green are more rural areas and dark green are more densely populated urban areas. Next slide. As we move forward to 2020, you can see the population density spreading out, especially in the central and northern portions of the watershed. And you might move back and forth just a couple times to animate that so that it's clear. Oh, sorry. We seem to be advancing forward, not backwards. There we go. And
then go forward?
yeah, maybe I can do it. So how does this work? Okay, forward. Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, so 2005, 2020. So you can see that density spreading out in the central core and in the north. And then the great thing about the TAZ is they essentially are planning documents, and so we have estimates for population out to 2035. And so if we project what's going to happen in 2035, we can see it spreading even further. So basically just kind of like an amoeba growing in the central and northern portions of the watershed especially. Thank you. So next slide. This population growth is a concern because the way the watershed is currently growing, and I want to be careful about what I say here, there is a strong correlation between population density and the percent of the watershed covered in impervious surfaces, such as roads, parking lots, and rooftops. In particular, we note that there's a nonlinear relationship, or what we might call a tipping point for imperviousness, between about 100 and 1,000 people per square mile, where under current growth policies, the imperviousness increases rapidly to 100%. I want you to kind of digest that. So this is the data from the watershed itself, right? The Occoquan watershed. It's not out of a textbook. This is actually from the watershed, showing essentially how population growth or population density correlates with that impervious surface in the watershed. It is important to stress that population growth can be managed, for example, using smart growth strategies in a way that would reduce the amount of imperviousness created with population growth. This graph just illustrates what we currently have, business as usual growth practices in the Occoquan watershed and how that results in increased imperviousness. Next slide. Next, we will explore what those population growth and impervious trends imply for stream and reservoir water quality. Next slide. For the past 50 years, the lab has been monitoring water quality at a set of stream stations in the Occoquan watershed. These streams drain very different subwatersheds ranging from highly rural to more urban. Imperviousness is illustrated here with color, where the color indicates when the imperviousness was added. For example, our stream station ST70 shown here drains a relatively rural area in Fauquier and Prince William counties, that's the green boundary there, with an average impervious area of just 1.2%. Next slide. Stream station ST25, another OWML station, drains a relatively rural area in Fauquier County with an average impervious area of 1.8%. Next slide. Station SC60 drains a relatively rural area in Prince William and Loudoun counties with an average impervious area of 2.8%. You can see we're just kind of working our way up that impervious fraction. Station ST10 drains the southwest portion of the watershed and has an average of 5.2% imperviousness. Next slide. ST30 drains an area upstream of Lake Manassas with an average of 7.1% imperviousness. Next slide. ST45 drains a portion of Prince William County and the cities of Manassas and Manassas Park with an average imperviousness of 18%. So we're really climbing to quite high numbers here. And then finally, Station ST50 on Cub Run drains portions of Fairfax County and Loudoun County with an average imperviousness of 30%. You can see Dulles Airport is kind of right at the upper boundary there of that watershed. Next slide. In this slide, I'm layering on the political jurisdictions onto the map that I just showed you, and you can see within Prince William County over the past 20 years, there's been significant increase in impervious cover north and south of Interstate 66 in Gainesville and surrounding communities. Next slide. Next, we look at how growth in population and imperviousness is translating to water qualities in the streams draining to the reservoir and the reservoir itself. Specifically, I've been asked to talk today about two types of pollutants that you heard Calvin talk about, salt and the forever chemicals PFAS. Next slide. Let's start with salinity trends. What I'm showing here in this graph is stream salinity represented on the vertical axis as specific inductance, measured at the 7 stations operated by the lab over the past 10 years. So those same 7 stations that I just showed you maps of. The main take-home lesson is that stream salinity progressively increases as we move from left to right, from low to high imperviousness, or equivalently from low to high population density on the top axis. That is, increasing impervious cover translates to more salts in streams, due primarily to, as Calvin said, the wash-off of de-icers and anti-icers that are applied to impervious surfaces in the winter. Next slide. What we find for this watershed is that threshold salinities, like the one shown in red here from one of the water quality managers in Fairfax County recommended this particular number, tend to be surpassed, it's the red line, tend to be surpassed when the imperviousness is greater than 3%, or when the population density upstream is greater than 60 people per square mile, just as a kind of rule of thumb. We find a similar pattern when we look at sodium ion measurements in these streams over the past 10 years. So the previous slide was kind of bulk salinity, looking at stream-specific inductance. Here we're looking very specifically at sodium. Next slide. Here, sodium ions are a concern, again, as Calvin pointed out, for water quality in the reservoir, both because of potential impacts on taste and also because sodium in drinking water can serve as a silent source of sodium, dietary sodium, which can be especially problematic for people on salt-restricted diets or elderly people. Next slide. And based on all of the monitoring data that we have today, flow and water quality data, here's a flow chart indicating or summarizing where sodium in the Occoquan reservoir is coming from on an annual basis. Note that 20% of the sodium in the reservoir is coming from reclaimed water, whereas you may recall from one of the earlier slides that only 6% of the water is coming from reclaimed water. That is, that reclaimed water is enriched in sodium. About 50% of the sodium in reclaimed water is from household sources. So if you want to know where that salt's coming from, look in the mirror. About half of that is dietary. so what we eat has salt. We excrete that ultimately, and it goes into the sewer system. While the other half is sodium-rich household products that ultimately go down the drain. And there's a real opportunity potentially for doing product switching, for example, to low-salt detergents. Next, we talk about PFAS. Specifically, I'm going to be focusing on a particular PFAS compound, PFOA, which Calvin mentioned, which is showing up in concentrations in the finished drinking water from Griffith, above the EPA's recent maximum contaminant level of 4 parts per trillion, or PPT. Next slide. Over the past year, under contract with Fairfax Water, the lab has been collecting samples throughout the watershed and analyzing them for PFAS by EPA method 1633. Our monitoring approach includes both fixed sites where we sample every month and floating sites where we sample once. Essentially, it's like a CSI. We're looking for potential sources in collaboration with Fairfax Water and the other jurisdictions. Here you can see in color the number of samples we've collected and analyzed for PFAS so far this year. The darker green circles correspond to fixed sites where we've sampled up to 11 times so far. The lab recently acquired the analytical equipment necessary to carry out these measurements, which are highly specialized. And the lab just hired a new faculty member, Professor Karen First, who is a leading expert in the topic areas. So I think we'll have everything that we need in terms of both equipment and expertise. While these data are preliminary, what we're seeing is roughly consistent with the salinity story that I just told. That is, we're seeing higher PFOA concentrations in streams and portions of the watershed, particularly in the north, in Cub Run, where impervious cover and population densities are high. So if you want to first order the formula for how this works, population growth leads to more impervious cover, leads to higher salt concentrations in streams and higher PFAS concentrations in streams. Next slide. Based on these data, here is a preliminary assessment of the sources of PFOA entering the Occoquan Reservoir. While both Bull Run and the Occoquan River are significant contributors at 22 and 31%, remember there's a lot of flow, so even very low concentrations of PFOA can result in a lot of mass. We're seeing that up to 39% or almost 40% of the PFOA mass entering the Occoquan Reservoir may be coming from UOSA's reclaimed water. Next slide. All of these data are serving as a starting point for a number of community-engaged initiatives aimed at developing equitable and cost-effective approaches for addressing water quality challenges in the Occoquan Reservoir both now and into the future. Next slide. The first one I would like to describe is funded with a planning grant from the National Science Foundation's Civic Innovation Challenge Program. Next slide. This is a 2-stage program. The first stage, which is currently what we have at the lab, provides $75,000 for a planning grant to develop with the community a stage 2 pilot test for some cutting-edge technology, which in our case is an interactive water quality model for the reservoir that can be used to stimulate community discussions about the future of the system. And it helps, I think, to give you a little bit of context. So in the past, the way it would work is if there was a question about the reservoir and water quality in the reservoir, the lab or another consulting firm or some other entity would be commissioned to do a study, which for a fair amount of money, and about a year later, you get an answer. You might have forgotten what the question was by the time you got the answer. The idea is that we're using cutting-edge technology to make that more or less instantaneous, so you can get on a model on the website and start asking and answering your own questions in real time. So that's kind of the goal of this activity. In fact, next week, we are running a set of 4 focus groups with different community organizations or individuals, including water utility managers and practitioners, elected officials. In fact, you all should have received an invitation to participate, business interests, and environmental NGOs. This is all building to a proposal to the NSF, which will be due in February of 2025, for up to $1 million to pilot test the model in those 4 communities. We are hoping through the focus group process to ultimately receive a letter of support to the effect that, look, if you guys build this model for us, we'll actually use it, right? So that will help, obviously, demonstrate impact. Next slide. This is just a summary of the key criteria we need to satisfy in the pilot test proposal, including that the project has to be rapid. We have to be able to realistically implement the model in 1 year because this is a 1-year pilot test, and so it gives us the $1 million. It has to be done in a year. It has to be local and co-created, which is what we're doing through the focus group process. And it has to be impactful. That is, this isn't a one-off that the community actually has. There's a chance that the community would actually adopt this, and evolve it for kind of planning purposes going forward. Along similar lines, and you saw this on one of Calvin's slides perhaps, we just received word that a proposal we submitted was selected for funding by the Water Research Foundation. This project would also utilize the interactive model of the reservoir that I was just talking about that the lab has developed, specifically with the goal of identifying equitable and cost-effective solutions to meeting those EPA MCLs for PFAS we were talking about, while minimizing costs to ratepayers across the system. The participating counties and water utilities, including Prince William Water and Prince William County, are indicated on the slide here. Next. And here's the basic idea. We'd like to investigate interventions across the watershed, including non-point source controls, pre-treatment requirements in the sewer shed, as well as treatment upgrades at Uosa and Griffith, with the overall goal of meeting the EPA MCLs while minimizing the overall cost to the community, recognizing that we receive multiple bills for a homeowner, for example, from wastewater utility for wastewater services, for drinking water services, and so on. And so really what matters is minimizing the overall cost, not necessarily just sticking the problem to a single utility like Fairfax Water. Next slide. And here are my conclusions. Next slide. Population and imperviousness are nonlinearly correlated throughout the watershed, and specifically imperviousness increases rapidly for population densities greater than about 60 people per square mile. As imperviousness and population density increase, stream salinity also increases, as evidenced by trends in specific conductance, sodium ions, and chloride ions, so that I didn't show you that data here. Preliminary data suggests that the forever chemical PFOA is also higher in streams that drain densely populated areas. We also find the reclaimed water is a source of both salinity and PFOA in this one water system. And finally, that the Occoquan Watershed Monitoring Lab and its stakeholders are creating an interactive modeling tool to facilitate community-driven, equitable, and cost-effective approaches for sustainably managing water quality in the Occoquan Reservoir now and into the future. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so very much for your presentation. I just want to see, we have Supervisor Franklin.
Yeah, and I think some of this may be answered by Mr. Farr, and so I'll just kind of go through a number of things. I want to actually go back to, start with the task force, actually. I think you all have been around since, what, January, so coming up on a year. Can you just talk about kind of the role that you all have played in some of these discussions so far in terms of which direction we should be going in terms of recommendations around salinity and PFAS, and what you think some of the recommended actions may be? You touched on some of them here and there, but just want to talk more so about the role of the task force and kind of the impact that you'll have on these discussions alongside legislators.
Thank you, Supervisor Franklin. Don Panel with Prince William Water. I'll start. We kicked off the task force, and Wade Hugh was a great partner. We kicked that off initially really trying to tackle RPA concerns and property concerns around the reservoir. So the task force has been very successful in connecting the right people in Prince William County with Fairfax Water, with Prince William Water playing a role to make sure we understand roles and responsibilities around RPAs. We see great opportunity to leverage the collaboration that's there for salinity challenges, which are also environmental type challenges. I think we're going to need to pull in, as Calvin and Dr. Grant touched on, I think we're going to need to pull in different partners to deal with PFAS because there are different types of contributors to the PFAS issue. But I think the model works well.
Yeah, and do you all plan to provide any type of recommendations either to the county or even the General Assembly, or is it more so bringing stakeholders together to kind of figure out how you all can mitigate internally with within your own organizations?
I think our to-do list right now is internal. I don't know, certainly I see opportunity going into next year for recommendations that maybe go outside of our internal control.
Sure, that's helpful, thank you. And then just more generally, just want to talk about your thoughts on how do we kind of prevent intrusion of salt into the Occoquan Reservoir generally. You talked about some things, but obviously it's been a challenge, but our salt levels kind of go up and down depending on the season. So if you can just talk about generally how we can get into a mode of having them at the lowest levels consistently.
Well, that's, yeah, I'm stumped. I'm stumped because it's coming from us. It's coming from our VDOT. I can't necessarily say VDOT stop using road salts because it's a public safety hazard. So at least from the PFAS side, there's alternatives to some of these chemicals that may be safer. Right now, the use of salt is right now is management of it, being smart with it. But I ultimately think it will result in some of that in messaging, best practices on our side, but also some more advanced treatment, quite honestly. When you're talking about drinking water, I can see that happening. I'm not sure what scale. That's where we're at right now. I mean, I don't think, I can't think anything else unless VDOT uses another alternative to road salts, you know.
Yep, and that's actually my next question around alternatives to salt. I know part of the challenge is salt is actually the most effective in getting rid of a lot of the ice that we see on the roads. There are some alternatives, but they're not as effective as salt. But just wondering what conversations you all have had with VDOT in the past around, you know, even if you use less effective measures, if you can use more of those less effective measures, do they eventually equal up to being as effective as the salt that VDOT is using? I know there's been some legislation around it that hasn't really moved forward, but just wondering your thoughts generally around that.
Yeah, so I'll have Don chime in after I finish, but there are discussions about beet juice and brine. What I see that it still requires a level of salt usage. So you're not going to be able to just say, we're going to use beet juice everywhere. And then there's other alternatives. I've been other places where they use sand. I don't find that to be as effective because if you don't put it on ice, it won't melt. So that's why I need to have this conversation with VDOT, which are trying to get on the schedule to get an idea. Hopefully they can have a better answer and say we're doing, since 10 years ago, we're doing this to manage it better.
Sure, and I'll do my second round when appropriate.
All right, Supervisor Gordy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So as you're putting together and reviewing options for us, and based upon some of the analysis that you've already done, it seems that a 3% impervious, it tends, anything below that tends to manage, better manage the challenges that we're facing. But as we get to more dense development, we get to more dense above that 3% pervious is where we start to look at and see the greater source point pollutants into the water system. Well, I wish we would have had this conversation 2 years ago when we were working through our comprehensive plan, because we could have helped, you know, as we start to look at, we require a lot of asphalt and a lot of parking and a lot of things that require salt. It requires a lot of water runoff. And, you know, we've had a couple of cases recently where we've had applicants come in and say we would rather have gravel than asphalt, and so they won that. But they were in the rural area, so which to me is actually preferable rather than having more asphalt on the ground. But, you know, are you looking at sort of those types of solutions and recommendations to help us better from a land use perspective and from a construction and building perspective to try to help get at this from the source?
Yeah, no, I think that's a brilliant question, and this was an issue that I felt, is a little subtle, right? So if you look at the historical data, which is what I showed you, that 3% number is where you see that really rise in fast rise in imperviousness, and also water quality effects, right? But the fact is that that's given status quo growth policies, right? So there's absolutely ways, smart growth policies of, adding population with minimizing runoff, with minimizing salt generation and so on. And so I think that that has to be part of the equation, right? Coming back to Supervisor Franklin, your question about, you mentioned the salinity levels kind of fluctuate in the Occoquan Reservoir. We actually know a little bit about that. So the way to think of it is that the de-icers on the impervious surfaces give these pulses, really high concentration pulses of sodium coming into the reservoir. So those peaks really are probably de-icer events during the winter. And we can see them wash into the reservoir and then go into the drinking water treatment plant and actually go out to homes and businesses. So we can see that wash all the way through. But they're very, relatively short, maybe a week or two long. You have enough of those, though, and it's like eating too much, then you start building up salts in the system, which then kind of leach out over time. So we see that effect as well. The other thing that's going on is that UOS's reclaimed water is discharging a steady stream of salt into the reservoir, right? And so that's kind of setting a baseline. Right? And then that, in turn, depends on industrial inputs. We talked a little bit about Micron, and I guess there's some news around potentially growth of Micron, and that obviously has implications for the water quality here. And also, 50% of that salt is coming from what we add. I don't think we're going to put the county on a salt-restricted diet to protect the reservoir. I don't think that's realistic. But we can have a conversation around, what kind of products we use. And there are sort of powdered detergents, for example, which have bulking agent. It doesn't serve any, functional purpose. It just bulks up the detergent, so it feels like you're buying more, I guess. And those tend to be things like sodium sulfate, so they tend to be very rich in sodium. So anyway, just kind of coming back to your question about fluctuations, we can actually kind of break it into pieces. And in the background, there's a geologic natural level too, but we're so far above that, it's kind of irrelevant. If we went back 50 or 100 years ago, there would be a kind of baseline level in this watershed as well.
Madam Chair, I'd just like to point out that he answered her question, so that's 2.5 minutes from her next period.
Sorry about that.
Supervisor Franklin, then Bodie.
Sure, yeah, just very quickly. We talked about the costs being passed on to ratepayers, but curious as to your thoughts, and this may be more of a discussion with the General Assembly or maybe even the feds, on how those increased costs can be passed on rather to industry rather than the ratepayers. Now, obviously, we know that we do, as individuals, contribute to some of these discussions that we've been having, but obviously industries contribute on a much greater level.
Yeah, agreed. I am able to meet with folks at the EPA regularly, and there's no discussion of that. It's here's the mandate, get it done, and typically what happens is the point source folks are the ones on the hook for it, and that's us. So that is a conversation. I think the EPA, some of the stuff is driving some of these class action lawsuits you're seeing to try to recover some of this, some of the cost. As you know, that's not always, you're not going to necessarily get all the costs from that.
Sure.
We got to, I'm not sure of the position of the new administration on that either. We assume that I'm hearing discussion of less regulation, deregulation in regards to the EPA, and could be to a point where funding is not going to be there and things of that nature. These are all possibilities.
Yep.
But we have said this over and over that this is not a water utility issue, go after the sources, and seems to get a lot of head nods, but not necessarily any action.
Sure, and that's something for us to maybe advocate for when we're having discussions with members of our delegation. Just a couple of comments, moving to the PFAS discussion. Obviously, this is a greater issue than Prince William County. This is a national issue. I will say Micron is working with the feds to kind of mitigate the impact that they've had over the years into the environment. But you just mentioned we need better regs. Now, the current administration has done a lot with regards to addressing PFAS, but we have to go a lot further because I think part of the challenge is we're still learning a lot about PFAS, particularly the inception of where PFAS is formed in the different products. So I think we need to have a lot more discussions, I think, on the federal level with regards to how waste is broken down and how PFAS comes from that. I'll also just say that more innovative technology is going to be required, I think, to have this discussion around PFAS, particularly with everyday products, because we're learning each day a new product that contributes to PFAS, and these are everyday things. When we talk about the fire department, and the suits that they wear, to me, that's very troubling, and we should be having that discussion of how we can make them safer as they go out every day wearing these uniforms several hours a day, and essentially taking in what essentially are chemicals, if we're being honest. And so I know that this is a discussion that goes well beyond Prince William County, but I appreciate what you all are doing to at least start to address kind of what we can do over the next 20 years or so to kind of mitigate the impact. And I think lastly, I'd just like to ask our county exec kind of what the discussion has been around salt generally and snow in the industry. As I understand, you've been part of some of those discussions. So thank you.
Sure. Well, in a prior life, I did fight snow, but we have been on a few calls in preparation for the winter season. So in terms of winter preparedness, I don't want to speak for VDOT, but the industry generally is certainly doing its best to pre-treat roads prior to inclement weather so that it decreases the amount of salt needed. I'll also say that there are some jurisdictions, VDOT included, contracting to have equipment that disperses road salt and liquid, so brine and beet juice at the same time. So essentially making, a mix of road salt and brine. So I think I say that to say that the industry is certainly doing its best to reduce the amount of road salt that it uses. And I don't know that there are any current discussions happening statewide to push, but I will say this is certainly top of mind for VDOT, and we'll continue the conversation around how we could be supportive locally.
Supervisor Bodie, then Bailey.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Dr. Grant, for the presentation. Good to see you again. Welcome back to Chambers. I appreciate as always, the detail you went into with the numbers and how the metrics are looking over time. I also appreciate the you sort of narrowing in on, to Supervisor Gordy's point, what the corollary issues are on the environment and the built environment, especially to what we're seeing as it pertains to salinity. So a couple of questions, because you talked about imperviousness, you talked about density and what have you. Based on what you've seen, especially over time, has that changed when we looked at areas that are really already built up and redevelopment has occurred? So it's imperviousness that's already exists, but the new structures are built, or there's more density in an existing area that's already been dense. And are there strategies that we could maybe implement, especially in terms of a revitalization and redevelopment strategy, where if we already have an area that's impervious that we know contributes towards this, are there things and strategies we can implement that if we're going to be revitalizing or redeveloping an area to add anyway, that we can look at to sort of to the point, as I say, possible, curtail some of this increased salinity, increased PFAS, and these other things?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think that the answer, common sense would say absolutely right. If you do a great job at minimizing runoff generation, if you do a great job at treating the runoff that you generate before it gets into streams, that's got to help. I think the situation that we're in now is that we haven't seen that in the data yet.
Sure.
Right? And it may be because we haven't looked precisely enough yet. It may be that our historical data isn't granular enough yet to see that effect. But I just want to really clarify that it makes a ton of sense to think carefully about how we manage stormwater runoff in particular. I mean, even the de-icer question, I mean, we run up against this, I think, false dichotomy of public safety versus water quality. I say it's a false dichotomy because the truth is, at the back end, how we handle the runoff from roads could be changed in such a way that we address it. You know, so we both have that public safety benefit, but we also keep the salt out of the stream. Without going into details, there are lots of ideas out there. So I think it's really imagination. It's probably policy around, you know, development and so on. So anyway, absolutely, that's the right way to go.
Appreciate that. And then a second question is, and it actually gets to the point that you just made, because yes, I know, as Supervisor Franklin sort of outlined, there is some movement maybe in the General Assembly, maybe looking at the salt on the roads vis-a-vis VDOT, but there's also, frankly, conversation around, especially here in Prince William County, where most of our roads are state maintained, how those are constructed, how they may be retrofitted with the gutters being able to have better filtration built in. I know that other parts of the country, other regions have more robust ways in which they help buffer their drains from sort of filtering through trash and other things and microplastics, things like that. So to your point, it's not an or, it's an and. It's a semicolon conversation of how can we make sure that we're continuing to do the things that are necessary from a public safety standpoint. So de-icing the roads, having firefighters that have the equipment that can protect them, having the products that we know help keep people safe from fires and other issues, but also looking at how we then look at our built environment and retrofit what we already have around that kind of issue. So my question there, there's a question there. My question is there any, once we get to the end, especially with the task force, and to the question that's been asked a couple times, are there going to be any recommendations that we can take, the state can take, to look at those issues? Because frankly, it's a comprehensive, all belts, suspenders, all hands on deck kind of approach, and will those kind of recommendations be available at the end?
Yeah, I'm not, I don't know if I'm on the task. Anyway, I think that the potential is high for something like that. So I guess I would step back a bit and say that things are really changing in this system, right? I mean, if you go back 40 or 50 years ago when the Occoquan policy was developed, the real issue in the reservoir were nutrients, right? And so we had serious algal blooms and so forth, and then the sewer systems were all consolidated. We had UOSA, high level of treatment, and so on. And we really solved that problem for at least the past 30 years. And if you look at the historical data, it's still pretty good from a nutrient perspective. But then now we have this emergence of other things which are really related to the built environment. Other water quality problems which are emerging from the built environment, and that's emerging because the amount of the watershed, the fraction of the watershed that's covered in the built environment is getting bigger and bigger. So the effects of that are going to be large too. And so I think the recommendations that have to come out are going to be looking at kind of a one water approach. If you look at it holistically, what can we do in the sewer shed to minimize salt generation and PFAS production, including, honestly, it's tricky having an major industry discharge to a wastewater treatment plant that then drains to a drinking water reservoir. That is an inherently tricky thing and needs very, very special attention, in my opinion. So you've got that conversation going on. You've got, what's going on in terms of what people put down the drain going on. Then you have the built environment and how we handle stormwater runoff and recommendations around that, particularly for redevelopment or new growth.
Supervisor Weir.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Let's continue that chain of thought because it goes back to where I started with the previous round of questions. if you're looking to reduce salinity and even PFAS, I'm assuming, based on your sodium mass loading diagram, you got reclaimed water accounts for 20% of the sodium mass loading, correct?
Right, and that's annually. So
Annually,
I just want to kind of caveat that by saying that day to day, that's hugely variable depending on how much rain.
And that's fine. But if we're looking at it on an annual basis, I'm assuming that the amount of water introduced into the reservoir from the reclaimed water is a tiny, minute fraction of that.
6%.
Coming from the Occoquan, so that's 6%. What is the
6%.
Occoquan River and what is Bull Run respectively? Roughly.
So it's in the slide, I think it's 40/27, something like that.
No, I meant in terms of water
Yeah,
volume.
Water volume. Yeah, actually, we could go back and rather than me speculating, we could get that number directly, I think. Oh, I see, it's the beginning of the, can we use the arrows here? No, it's, seems to be disabled.
You're in trouble if she's your technical expert.
You are not joking.
Only kind of.
Ah, okay.
I don't know why this one isn't working. Okay. This
Okay,
mouse will be
beautiful,
easier.
beautiful. Okay, so,
I said beautiful.
yeah, exactly. You are beautiful. So let's see if I can't get it to work. Oh, here we go. Yeah, so the number you were looking for is actually earlier on. Yep. Yeah, okay.
So 6%,
Here's the number. So Occoquan River is almost 50%, Bull Run's 25%, reclaimed water 6%.
So your real bang for the buck, because your reclaimed water has essentially a three.
I know where you're going.
It's
Yeah. So one of the
two and a
things
half times that of the Occoquan and twice more than that of Bull Run. So your bang for the buck on a sodium recovery, your focus needs to be on that 6% of the water.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you're looking at problems like this, there's really two numbers that are important. One is the mass load, which I'm showing here, or the water volume. The other is the concentration, right? So Occoquan River is
That's what I'm getting at. There's your concentration.
Yeah, Occoquan River is a lot of water, but it's a low concentration, so that leads to a high mass.
Thus making it harder to address.
The reclaimed water is sitting at around 60 milligrams per liter of sodium.
Yeah.
And so, absolutely, that's the target in terms of concentration.
Is that your target for remediation?
Well, and there's some low-hanging fruit there.
I would suggest it's more than low-hanging fruit, given the volume.
Let me add. Yep, so the question is yes, I've talked to UOSA. The county has 2 seats on the board. I have one, have another board member. So I've had constant conversations about salinity and what you can do from a treatment standpoint. So we actually can reduce that salinity with the reclaimed water. So that has been a directive somewhat. So again, PFAS, addressing that, and then the close second is the salinity aspect.
Yeah, and I don't mean to blame you also. Actually, they add a tiny fraction of the salt, around 1% or so. They are the recipients of salt.
I was by no means blaming UOSA. I was blaming the people upstream of UOSA.
Exactly.
So,
Yeah. That's,
which, to my earlier comment.
Yep.
All right, doesn't look like we have anyone else. Thank you so very much for this thorough presentation, both of you. Thank you.